radio is certainly one of the most difficult mediums to write for. But it is remarkably rewarding. The reason that it's more difficult is that you have to tell a story in a much different style. You're actually talking to people as opposed to writing to people, and so it's important for you. To describe things that you might not need to describe in a TV spot, or that you might not need to describe in a newspaper article. But in order to get that conversation moving, in order for people to start to listen to you, you have to put people into a sense of place. So you have to take them somewhere, so you have to be very descriptive. Some people call it theater of the mind. But what we're doing is we're taking you to a place that we're writing about. And that can be very challenging for people, because you have to say things like, we're standing in a field that farmers have just planted. There's mud on my shoes. You have to be very descriptive about those little things. And those little things plant those seeds, those images in people's minds. You don't need to do that for video. And for some, you don't really need to do that for print either. But for radio, in order to get people's attention and put them there, you have to say those things. You have to take them to that place. The other aspect of radio writing, of course, is the audio, the sound that we use. The sound bites obviously are important. But that natural sound, the background sound, the stuff that really says where you're at, that is very important to have to again, help people go to that place where you're telling the story, and to make sure that they see that in their mind. Oftentimes you'll hear very common sounds. A car driving by, birds tweeting, construction noise. We use those sounds a lot, but as soon as we say to you, it's a busy street in downtown Lansing, your mind goes right to downtown Lansing. So you're there. You can see that streetscape. But you have to tell people what that sound is. It might just be a car or a truck passing by, but immediately you have to say, downtown Lansing. Give them that place so they say, oh, that's where I am. Video, you show a video of downtown Lansing, there they are. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to write anything into that. And you might not even need to tell people you're in downtown Lansing when you write an article for a paper. So putting people into that place is very important. The other real challenge to this job is that soundbite. You don't need to worry about that soundbite in print. That you can paraphrase whatever anybody says, and you can use very short quotes, and as long as you're keeping them in context, nobody's going to complain if it's not exact. We don't have that option in radio. In radio, that soundbite has to make sense. If it doesn't make sense, we have to make it make sense. We can't edit it for context, but we can edit it to some extent so that it makes more sense than it may have made in another context. We can move things around a little bit to make it make more sense. But you also have to write into that soundbite and out of that soundbite so that the soundbite makes sense, if I'm making any sense. So what you put in front of that soundbite has to explain to people what they're going to hear in the soundbite. And that's harder to do than you would think, because you can't paraphrase what that person says. They say it. And you can't say exactly what they said because they've said it. So somehow you have to figure out a way to go into that soundbite and make it make sense, and then come out of that soundbite with a continuation of the story. And believe me, people don't talk in perfect sound bites. And so the biggest problem that we have is that you don't ever have a perfect sound bite to work with. And so you have to be creative about how you write into it and how you write out of it. You can't paraphrase. If I just had print features to write, I'd be home free. It would be a piece of cake. But because I have to write for radio, because I have to write around what other people are saying and be very concise about it, it can take a lot of time and challenge. and then putting all of those sound bites together to make them make sense and to put them in the right order and to have a really solid and coherent story, that's another challenge too. The two biggest things that are important in radio, clarity and brevity. And so you have to be clear, you have to be brief. And if your writing isn't clear, people aren't going to listen. Because if they get confused for even a second or two, they're gone. They tune out. It's too much to think about. So you have to make it very clear. And that can be very challenging to do in a radio piece, especially when you're dealing with people who aren't used to using sound bites the way we use them.
In today's multimedia world, sometimes you go out to do one story with all the bits, and then you have to make different stories out of them. And that's different if you're going to render a video from it, audio from it, text from it, or a package of all three. And so deciding which pieces you put into what format and how you assemble all of these could seem like a giant puzzle.
I write 3 stories now for about every subject I work on. I write one for video, I write one for radio, and I write one for the web. And all 3 of them are unique. They may tell the same story, but I try to use different characters in all 3. Especially with the video aspect, instead of trying to tell the whole story we might try to tell in radio, we like to keep it fairly short and tell one aspect of that story. So we might only have one character in a television story, where in a radio story we might have 3. So we might only have one point of view, but it's going to be an important point of view. It's not going to be a biased point of view, but it's going to be an important point of view. The radio piece, again, will have maybe 3 characters and several scenes. So it takes a lot of time to write into those scenes and write into those characters. And that's the hardest, still the hardest one to write, is the radio piece. And then finally, for the online version, you might consider the print version, that is sort of a combination of print and radio. You still have to be clear and brief, because even though you might think that online you have an infinite amount of space to work with, the reality is most people don't have an infinite amount of attention, so you have to write very clearly and keep it short. But you don't need any sound bites, so you can take those out. You can paraphrase those and cut things down, and you can add in numbers and tables and graphs, or even photos that you would not have put into a radio story and you would not have put into a video story. Because while people do have a short attention online, they also have the ability to move from one segment to the other and then focus on that graph or that picture and then go back to the article. So there are 3 different styles of writing. Radio's the hardest. Radio's the hardest writing I've ever done. But they're all very important, and it's a lot of fun.
Do you refer to them as sort of NPR-ish stories? Because that's what I think of them as. Did they invent that genre?
I don't know if they invented it. They certainly did perfect it, where you have a story that is, 4 to 8 minutes, let's say. We try to keep them under 4, with sound and scenes and all of that good stuff mixed in. It's a different type of news telling than you hear just about anywhere else. I don't know of any other radio news organization that tells the stories the way we tell them in NPR. As an NPR affiliate, we try to write along the NPR guidelines. We listen to their stories, we follow their rules, we play by those games. But that's what our listeners expect. So we have to sound seamless. When you listen to Morning Edition, if a story is done by Silvia Poggioli in Italy, and then you hear Rob South in Bancroft, they really have to sound like they work for the same organization and they've done the same type of work. And so we try to do the same style of writing. And we train to do that. I mean, there are books and there's training, and we work really hard to make sure that our stories are the same quality that you would hear on NPR.
As you're moving more and more to the web, tell me how your project, reWorking Michigan, fits into that new approach of putting all these pieces together on the web.
reWorking Michigan started back in January of 2010, and it was an occasional series that we did on the economy and jobs. And so the focus of the series is the economy and jobs. And believe me, we can put a lot of stuff into the economy and jobs category, and so there's really no shortage of stories that we do. This past April, we took it to a regular series, so now it's on weekly on WKAR, and also added the video segment. And so for these several months, we've been doing video, online, and radio as a regular series. So every week it has to be done. And once you have that deadline attached, it's a little bit more daunting. It's kind of nice when you can say, well, the story might need to be done on Monday, but maybe Tuesday. We don't have that luxury anymore. We finally have a place where we can put all of the pieces together and people can consume them however they'd like. And where we can put additional information that wouldn't have fit on TV, that wouldn't have fit on the radio, so that people can consume that information as well. I think that's probably the biggest thing about the internet, is that you can pull things together in one place and make it easy for people to get access to that information. Like everybody else, we're still working on it. It's still, we're finding our way, and that's hard to do. But it is, I think it is a fantastic place to do broadcast journalism. Anybody who's got an interest in television, anybody who's got an interest in radio, anybody who's got an interest in print journalism or photography or graphics, I mean, the internet brings those things together in a place where you can do a story and tell that story in several different ways so that the audience can get a better understanding of what the story is, or consume it in a way that they may not have been able to consume it before. So it's just an amazing, amazing place. But it also means I'm not just a radio reporter anymore. I don't just go out with my audio recorder and record sound. I also have to think about the pictures. Fortunately, I have a good videographer, an editor, and he takes care of the video, because that's a skill that's far more difficult than a lot of people believe. And so he can help tell that side of the story. But I do take stills every day for stories, and it is a challenge, but it's also one of those challenges that just gets you excited, because it gives you more to work with when you're telling a story. There are always parts of a story that you can't tell in one medium or another, and so having the ability now to tell those parts, it actually gets a little overwhelming, because now you've got too much to say.
Which stories are worth that kind of treatment?
Absolutely, and that's another challenge we have too, because with reWorking Michigan, we are committed, at least for the time being, of producing a radio story, a web story, and a video story for the same package. Well, that means that all three have to fit in there somehow. And it's not impossible, but sometimes, I want to say this is going to be a better radio story than it is a video story. And I might not want to do a video on it. I just want to do a radio piece on it, but I still have to do something involving video with it. So we try to find something that will fit in that story's context that isn't necessarily the radio story. And so we do a different story that's the same, but it's connected, it's related to the story, but it's a different story, if that makes any sense.
How many of those a week are you expected to do, and what are your days like? What is your day on the job like, or are no 2 days alike?
Well, it used to be that no 2 days were alike, and that's still the case. The load is pretty light right now. I only have to do one package a week, and that can be both a blessing and a curse. I can say that right now my weeks are usually fairly bottom heavy. Early in the week, I do some planning. I make decisions on what story I'm going to air for the following week, and I start calling and setting up interviews. I have to coordinate a videographer now, so that's another schedule that I have to think about. So I didn't have that before. Then I have to work in the writing of the video script with my videographer's availability too. And let's face it, writers are usually pretty lonely people. We can do it whenever we feel like doing it, and with my laptop I can write from anywhere. 3 o'clock in the morning from my bedroom sometimes. Well, my videographer is not coming over to my bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning. He's only here till 5. So I better figure it out before we go into production. So, there's some stress that's put on me to develop a story in advance of actually going out and getting the video, and then I have to write the story with the video that we've collected and put that story together so that he can then edit the story and produce the story for video. But I also have a radio story and a print story to produce as well. And so my deadline is typically 5 o'clock on a Friday. The whole package airs on Monday morning. And so, I have a tendency to put off the stuff that requires just me, which is usually the radio and the print story, and focus on what the teamwork is, because I don't want the team to have to work the weekend if they don't have to. So, there's a tendency for things to pile up, the writing to pile up toward the end of the week. And, sometimes I end up working on the weekend, which is okay. For me, it's not really work.
And what about your relationship with your editor? Who edits which pieces, and how do you work that out?
That is a good question, and we work that out usually depending on who's available in the news department to do an edit. We're still working on how to formalize the editing process for video and for online. We're used to editing each other for radio. So we've always listened to each other's stories. We've always sat down, before you produce a story, after you've written it, with another producer, and you listen to it and you make sure everything's there. Well, now we have these other elements to work with. And so as we have worked with video now, we have to look at the video editor, my videographer, and he often does the edit with me on the video piece. So he says, okay, this is going to work here, that won't work there. And he has some journalistic background, so he knows what's good and what's not, which is very important. And so he edits those pieces. And then the radio people still edit the radio piece. And then it's whoever is available to look over that online piece, take a look at that and make sure I've spelled everything correctly before it goes out online. And we mess up occasionally, but that's sort of the nature of it. I mean, everybody's doing a different job now, and so we still, everything still gets an edit before it goes up. A second pair of eyes has to look at it, but it's split up between a number of people. Now, I should say that as the lead producer for reWorking Michigan, before any of it goes out, even after the edit, even after the production, I take a look at it one more time to make sure it's right. So even though I've produced the radio spot and the TV spot and the online copy, once I get it to the online place, before I hit the, okay, make this public button, I take a look at it one more time to make sure that I've spelled everything correctly, that all of the elements are there that need to be there, that everything is ready to go. And that can be stressful too, because anybody who's edited their own work knows that it's nearly impossible to catch those mistakes. So with a small staff, we do what we have to do, and I think it's working out pretty well.
What about the idea that these become evergreen packages? I mean, they're really well-crafted packages, and they're not necessarily things that are breaking news. So, I mean, they're not as timely in that sense. They don't become stale news. They're not like the lining the bottom of the birdcage the next day.
You know, they have to be both. And it's very difficult to make... I'm a news guy. I don't want to do evergreen stories all day long, and I can't. And so the stories that we produce, we try to make them relevant and timely, with the understanding that they have to have legs. You know, they can't just be here and gone. But I think that that's been the case for a long time since we've been working online, when we've been putting stories online. And it isn't so much about the story or the subject. In some cases, it's the way you write it. But I also think that making it a decent production in and of itself will give it that kind of timeliness, and making sure it's dated, that people will understand when you're saying, you know, this month online, if there's a date of, you know, May 2011, you know, you can pretty much guess if you're watching it in December of 2022 that we're not talking about this particular month, but this month that we actually produced that. So we have to trust that the listener or the viewer or the consumer is going to be smart enough to figure out that we didn't just do that when it came to their attention. But at the same time, we want it to be good enough so that it will last indefinitely, so that when you take a look at that, you'll get something out of it. Maybe it's a snapshot in time, but at the same time, it's got to be something that people are going to look at in a couple of months and say, "Wow, I learned something from that. It's still relevant," even though it may have been something that happened, you know, years ago. But think about how you read the newspaper, and newspapers have long been archives for historians. Nobody writes the newspaper with the idea that it's going to stick around for decades or centuries. You write the newspaper for the news. It's right up there. It's right up front. So I think you have to do this. You have to understand that the same thing happens online, that we can't write things just so they stick around. We have to write things for the here and now and trust that our consumers are going to understand that when we produce this piece, this was what was happening, and this was the context it was in. And we can't go back and second guess it. We can't go back and change things just because maybe the details of the story have changed since we produced that. That's when you produce a whole nother piece, you know. So while you could say that all the pieces have to be evergreen, I would say that just naturally, if they're good pieces, they're going to be evergreen.